The water is black, not calm, just still, too still. A line of oil tankers drifts through the darkness, engines low, lights dimmed, steel giants, each one carrying millions of barrels of crude, each one moving through a passage so narrow there is no room for error. On the bridge a radio crackles, then silence, no signal, no update, just the hum of machinery, and the growing sense that something is wrong. Because tonight, this route, this thin strip of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, has become the most dangerous place on Earth. Warships are watching, missiles are within range, and somewhere along this choke point, a single decision is being considered, one that could stop the flow of oil to the entire world, not disrupt it, stop it. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, even for a few days, the consequences won't stay here. They won't stay in the Middle East. They will reach every country, every industry, every home, fuel prices, food supply, global markets, all of it tied to this one narrow passage. And tonight, for the first time in years, the question is no longer theoretical. What happens if it actually happens? By daylight, the strait doesn't look like a place that could shake the world. It looks ordinary. Blue water stretching between two coastlines, Iran to the north, Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south, fishing boats, cargo ships, tankers moving in slow, deliberate lines. But look closer, because what appears wide and open is anything but. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is just 33 kilometers across, and within that space, the actual shipping lanes, the corridors that tankers must follow, shrink to only a few kilometers in each direction. Two thin lines, one for incoming traffic, one for outgoing. That's it. Every ship passing through this gateway is funneled into those lanes. No deviation, no flexibility, no second route. And through those lanes flows something the modern world cannot live without. Oil. Not a small amount, not a regional supply. Nearly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption passes through this single stretch of water, around 20 million barrels every single day. To understand what that means, imagine removing one out of every 5 drops of fuel used on Earth. Gone overnight. This is the only maritime exit for the Persian Gulf, the energy heart of the world, the place where some of the largest oil producers on the planet operate, all connected to this one narrow outlet. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, the United Arab Emirates. Their exports don't scatter across multiple routes, they converge here, which means every tanker you see crossing this strait isn't just another ship. It's a moving piece of the global economy. And there's something else. Unlike other major trade routes, there is no true alternative, no parallel canal, no nearby detour that can absorb this volume. If a passage is blocked, the system doesn't reroute smoothly. It strains, it slows, and very quickly it begins to break. Because the world didn't build redundancy into this system, it built dependence on a narrow corridor of water, where a single disruption can ripple outward faster than anyone can respond. And that raises an uncomfortable reality. If everything depends on this passage, what happens when it stops? What moves through the Strait of Hormuz isn't just oil. It's the fuel that keeps entire continents running. Every day, an unbroken stream of tankers carries crude from the Gulf to the rest of the world, feeding power plants, fueling industries, sustaining transportation networks that millions rely on without ever seeing the source. Around 20 million barrels pass through here daily, but the destination of that energy tells an even deeper story. Nearly all of it flows east, toward Asia, China, India, Japan, South Korea, nations whose economies depend on a constant, uninterrupted supply of energy. Factories, shipping networks, entire cities powered by oil that begins its journey in these waters. For some of these countries, there is no quick replacement, no domestic reserves large enough, no alternative routes fast enough. If this flow slows, their economies feel it first. But oil is only part of the picture. The strait is also one of the world's most critical corridors for liquefied natural gas, LNG. Massive carriers, cooled to extreme temperatures, transporting energy in liquid form across thousands of kilometers. Month after month, thousands of these vessels pass through this same narrow passage, and alongside them, container ships, bulk carriers, vessels loaded with raw materials, electronics, machinery, and food. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just an energy route, it's a global trade artery. Major ports in the Gulf, like Jebel Ali and Khalifa, depend on it to connect with markets across Asia, Europe, and Africa. Everything from construction materials to consumer goods moves through this system. So when we talk about disruption here, we're not just talking about fuel shortages, we're talking about supply chains slowing, factories waiting, ports backing up, prices rising, not in one country, but everywhere. And the scale of that impact grows with every hour the flow is interrupted. Because unlike many global systems, this one operates on constant motion. There are no large reserves sitting idle, waiting to absorb a shock of this size. Only movement, continuous, fragile movement through a passage that has no equal. Which means, if that movement is interrupted, even briefly, the effects don't stay contained. They spread. Faster than the ships that carry the oil itself, the threat to the Strait of Hormuz doesn't begin with explosions. It begins with a statement, a warning, delivered not on the battlefield, but through microphones, press briefings, and political signals. In recent years, as tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States have intensified, that warning has returned again and again. If Iran is attacked, the strait could be closed, not occupied, not invaded, closed. And that distinction matters, because this isn't conventional warfare. It's something far more calculated. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a location, it's leverage, a pressure point, one that Iran can use without ever launching a full-scale war. Think about the balance. On one side, the United States and its allies, with superior naval power, global reach, overwhelming force. On the other, a narrow channel of water that those same powers depend on to keep the global economy running. Iran doesn't need to defeat a navy. It only needs to make this passage unusable. That's the strategy. Not destruction, but disruption. Not control, but uncertainty. Because in global markets, perception can be as powerful as reality. If shipping companies believe the strait is unsafe, they hesitate. If insurers see rising risk, premiums surge. If crews fear attack, routes are delayed or avoided entirely. And suddenly, without a single shot fired, the flow begins to slow. Prices rise, markets react, governments respond, all triggered by the possibility, not even the certainty, of closure. This is economic warfare in its purest form. A way to reach far beyond borders, beyond armies, beyond missiles, and strike directly at the systems that hold modern life together. But this raises a deeper question. Is this just a threat meant to influence negotiations? Or is it something that has already been tested, again and again, in the waters of the Gulf? The idea of disrupting the Strait of Hormuz isn't new. It's been tested repeatedly, not in one decisive moment, but in a pattern that stretches back decades. The most dangerous chapter began in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War. What started as a land conflict quickly spread to the sea. Oil tankers became targets, not because of what they carried, but because of what they represented. Economic lifelines. Both sides began attacking commercial vessels in what became known as the tanker war. Hundreds of ships were damaged, crews were killed, insurance costs surged, and for years the waters of the Gulf turned into a zone of constant threat. The Strait of Hormuz was never fully closed, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. This route could be destabilized, and the world was forced to pay attention. Decades later, that strategy hasn't disappeared. It has evolved. In 2011 and again in 2012, as sanctions tightened around Iran's economy, the same warning resurfaced. Close the strait, disrupt the flow. Push back, not with invasion, but with pressure. The threats weren't carried out, but they didn't need to be. Because by then, the world already understood what was at stake. Then came 2019. 4 vessels were attacked near the entrance of the strait, off the coast of the United Arab Emirates, among them Saudi oil tankers. The damage was limited. The message was not. Tensions surged, accusations followed, and once again, the vulnerability of this narrow passage was exposed. In the years that followed, the pattern continued. Tankers seized, ships detained for months, cargoes intercepted in apparent retaliation for sanctions and asset seizures. In 2022, 2 Greek oil tankers were taken and held for half a year. In 2023, another vessel was seized while heading toward the United States, and in 2024, just before a major escalation with Israel, a cargo ship linked to Israeli interests was captured near the strait. Each incident on its own might seem contained, limited, temporary, but together they form something much larger, a demonstration, a signal that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a passage. It's a pressure point that can be activated, tested, and controlled in fragments, never fully closed, never pushed to the absolute limit, but always close enough to remind the world how fragile the system really is. Because disruption doesn't have to be constant to be effective. It only has to be believable. And after decades of tension, incidents, and calculated moves, that belief is already there. Which leads to the next question. If history has shown how to destabilize the strait, how exactly would you shut it down completely? Closing the Strait of Hormuz doesn't mean dropping a barrier across the water. There is no gate, no wall, no single point you can shut. Instead, it's done by turning the entire passage into a place ships cannot safely enter. Because in global shipping, closed doesn't always mean physically blocked. It means too dangerous to risk. And there are several ways to create that kind of danger. The first is mines. Small, cheap, difficult to detect. Naval mines don't need to sink dozens of ships to be effective. Just one successful strike, one tanker damaged or destroyed, is enough to send shockwaves through the entire system. Shipping companies pull back, crews hesitate, insurers react instantly. And suddenly, traffic slows to a crawl. Clearing mines isn't quick. It takes time, precision, and specialized vessels. And during that time, the uncertainty grows. The second method is speed. Fast attack boats, small, highly maneuverable, capable of approaching large tankers in seconds. They don't need to engage in full combat. Just getting close is enough to create tension, harassment, interception, the threat of escalation at any moment. A supertanker weighing hundreds of thousands of tons cannot turn quickly. It cannot accelerate out of danger. It becomes vulnerable simply by being there. Then come the missiles, coastal batteries positioned along the Iranian shoreline, overlooking the strait. From those positions, anti-ship missiles can reach deep into the shipping lanes. They don't need to be fired continuously. Just the knowledge that they could be changes everything. Because every captain entering the strait would know they are within range. And then there are seizures, boarding operations, forcing ships to change course, detaining them, holding them for weeks or months. Each incident reinforces the same message. This passage is no longer predictable. And unpredictability is something global trade cannot tolerate. But perhaps the most powerful weapon isn't any of these. It's fear. Because the global shipping system is built on calculated risk. Routes are chosen based on safety, cost, and reliability. The moment those calculations change, everything changes. Insurance premiums spike. Some routes become financially impossible. Others become operationally unacceptable. And even without a full blockade, traffic begins to thin. Ships delay departure. Companies search for alternatives. Markets react before the first major disruption even occurs. This is how a strait closes in the modern world, not with a single decisive act, but through a buildup of pressure, risk, and uncertainty. Until one day, the flow slows to a point where it can no longer sustain what depends on it. And when that happens, the effects won't be gradual, they will be immediate, because the system behind it was never designed to stop, only to keep moving. And the moment it doesn't, the consequences begin. It wouldn't take weeks to feel the impact. It wouldn't even take days. The moment the Strait of Hormuz becomes unsafe, the reaction begins almost instantly. Within hours, shipping companies start to hesitate. Tankers scheduled to enter the strait slow down or stop altogether. Some anchor offshore, waiting for clarity. Others turn away completely. And as that hesitation spreads, the first signal appears where the world is always watching. The price of oil. It spikes. Fast. Markets don't wait for confirmation. They react to risk, to uncertainty, to the possibility that nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply could be disrupted at any moment. Prices climb past thresholds that ripple through every economy. $100 per barrel, then higher. Some projections push toward 120, depending on how long the disruption lasts. And behind those numbers is something more immediate. Panic. Energy traders rush to secure supply. Governments begin assessing reserves. Emergency meetings are called because no one knows how long this will last. Hours, days, longer. And in a system built on constant flow, even a short interruption creates pressure. Refineries begin to calculate shortages. Shipping schedules collapse into uncertainty. Fuel distributors prepare for rising costs, all while the physical supply, the oil itself, is still sitting on tankers, unable or unwilling to pass through the most critical gateway on Earth. This is the first phase. Not collapse, but shock. A sudden realization that something fundamental has changed, that the system everyone relies on is no longer stable. And as those first 48 hours unfold, the question is no longer if the impact will spread, but how far and how fast. The first shock is immediate, but what follows is slower, deeper, and far more damaging. Because the global economy doesn't break all at once, it unravels, one system at a time. As oil stops flowing freely through the Strait of Hormuz, the countries that depend on it most begin to feel the strain. Not weeks later, almost immediately. Across Asia, refineries start to face uncertainty. Supplies that were scheduled, expected, already accounted for, no longer arrive on time. China, India, Japan, South Korea, economies built on constant energy intake suddenly face disruption at the source. And energy is not something you can easily replace overnight. Reserves exist, but they are finite. Alternative suppliers exist, but they are limited. And the infrastructure to reroute massive volumes of oil simply isn't built for a shock of this scale. So adjustments begin. Factories slow production, some halt entirely. Because without fuel, machines don't run. Without energy, output drops. And when output drops, everything connected to it begins to shift. Transportation is next. Fuel prices rise not gradually, but sharply. Airlines reassess routes, shipping companies increase costs, trucking networks pass those costs down the chain, and that chain leads somewhere very familiar. Everyday life. Food becomes more expensive to transport. Goods take longer to arrive. Electricity prices begin to climb in regions tied to imported energy. What started as a disruption in a distant strait begins to appear in places far removed from it. Supermarkets, gas stations, monthly bills. And then comes the pressure on supply chains, because modern logistics depend on precision, on timing, on predictability. Raw materials that were meant to arrive at ports are delayed, components needed for manufacturing are stuck in transit, assembly lines that rely on just-in-time delivery begin to stall. Small delays compound into larger ones, ports become congested, schedules collapse, and the ripple effect expands outward, from energy to industry to consumers. At the same time, businesses begin to absorb rising costs. Insurance premiums increase, shipping becomes more expensive, risk calculations change, and those costs don't stay contained, they move. Passed from producer to distributor, from distributor to retailer, from retailer to customer, until the impact becomes visible everywhere, not as a single event, but as a gradual tightening, prices rising, availability shrinking, uncertainty growing. This is how a disruption becomes a global problem, not through one dramatic collapse, but through a chain reaction that touches everything connected to energy. And in a world built on interconnected systems, that means everything. Because once the dominoes start falling, they don't stop halfway. The disruption doesn't stay in shipping lanes. It moves into the financial system. And when it does, the reaction is immediate. Markets begin to swing violently. Stock exchanges around the world respond to uncertainty the only way they know how, with speed. Investors start pulling back, shifting capital, trying to anticipate what comes next. Energy companies surge, airlines drop, manufacturing stocks begin to slide as the cost of production rises. And across global markets, one pattern becomes clear: fear. Because financial systems don't wait for outcomes. They react to expectations, the expectation of higher oil prices, the expectation of disrupted supply chains, the expectation of slowing economic growth. And those expectations begin to price themselves in. Indices fall, volatility spikes, safe haven assets, gold, government bonds start to rise as investors look for stability in a moment that offers very little of it. At the same time, another pressure builds beneath the surface. Insurance. For ships passing through the region, premiums surge almost instantly. What was once a routine transit becomes a high-risk operation. Costs multiply. Some voyages become too expensive to justify. Others become too dangerous to insure at all. And without insurance, ships don't sail. This is where the system tightens further. Trade slows not just because of physical risk, but because of financial reality. Credit becomes more cautious, banks reassess exposure, companies delay decisions, and all of it feeds back into the same cycle: uncertainty creating hesitation, hesitation creating slowdown, slowdown reinforcing uncertainty, until the global economy begins to feel something more than disruption: instability. Not confined to one region, not limited to one sector, but spreading across markets, across industries, across borders. And just as that instability begins to take hold, another possibility emerges, one that could turn economic tension into something far more dangerous. Up to this point, everything can still be contained: economic pressure, market instability, disrupted trade, serious but manageable. But the Strait of Hormuz is not just an economic corridor, it's a strategic one. And if that corridor is threatened long enough, military forces begin to move. The United States maintains a constant naval presence in the region. Warships, aircraft carriers, patrol vessels, all ready positioned to respond to any disruption in global shipping. Their mission is clear: keep the strait open at any cost, and they wouldn't be alone. European powers, through NATO alliances, could be drawn in: the United Kingdom, France, other nations with direct economic and strategic interests tied to the flow of energy through these waters. On the other side, Iran, with coastal defenses, fast attack craft, missile systems, and years of preparation focused on one objective: controlling access to this narrow passage. And this is where the situation becomes dangerous, because unlike economic pressure, military movement introduces something far less predictable: escalation. A single confrontation at sea, a warning shot that goes too far, a miscalculation in a moment of tension, and suddenly, what began as a disruption to shipping becomes a direct conflict between armed forces. The Strait of Hormuz is too important to ignore, too valuable to abandon, which means if it closes, there is a real possibility that it doesn't stay an economic crisis for long. It becomes something else: a flashpoint, one capable of pulling multiple nations into a conflict that extends far beyond the water itself. And once that line is crossed, there is no easy way back. When a crisis like this unfolds, the impact is global, but it isn't equal. Some countries feel the shock immediately, others slightly less, and a few are better positioned to absorb it. The nations most exposed are the ones most dependent on the flow through the Strait of Hormuz. Across Asia, the reliance is deep. China imports massive volumes of crude from the Gulf, fueling its industries, powering its cities. India follows closely behind, with growing demand tied directly to economic expansion. Japan and South Korea, with limited domestic energy resources, depend heavily on stable imports to sustain their entire infrastructure. For these countries, disruption isn't just an inconvenience, it's a direct threat to economic stability. Production slows, energy costs surge, and the pressure builds quickly. At the same time, the countries Exporting that energy, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates face a different kind of loss. Not shortage, but blockage. Their economies rely on selling oil, and if that oil can't leave the Gulf, revenue stops, tankers remain idle, storage fills, and the financial impact begins to mount from the other side of the equation. Then there are the countries somewhat insulated from the immediate shock. The United States, for example, imports relatively less through the strait compared to its total consumption. Europe, while still affected, draws from a more diversified set of suppliers. They are not immune, but they are less exposed, and in global crises that difference matters. Because resilience isn't about avoiding impact entirely. It's about how much pressure a system can absorb before it begins to fail. In this case, the pressure is uneven. Some economies bend quickly, others hold longer, but none escape the consequences completely. Because even if the disruption begins in one region, the effects don't stay there. They spread through trade, through markets, through the invisible connections that tie every economy together, which means in the end, there are no true winners, only those who lose more slowly than others. With everything at stake, the obvious question remains, if the Strait of Hormuz is this vulnerable, this critical, why hasn't it been closed? The answer is simple. Because the consequences don't fall on just one side. They fall on everyone, including Iran. Closing the strait wouldn't just disrupt global markets, it would also cut off Iran's own ability to export oil, one of its most important sources of revenue. In trying to pressure its adversaries, it would also be damaging itself. And beyond economics, there is the military reality. Any sustained attempt to block the strait would almost certainly trigger a response, not symbolic, not limited, but overwhelming. Naval forces from the United States and its allies are already positioned to ensure that this passage remains open. A full closure would not go unanswered. It would escalate quickly, with consequences that could extend far beyond the region. So what exists instead is a balance, a constant tension between capability and restraint. Iran has shown that it can disrupt the system, but stopping it entirely would cross a line that risks something much larger than leverage, something uncontrollable. And so, for now, the strait remains open, not because it is safe, but because closing it would change everything. Night returns to the Strait of Hormuz. The water is quiet again. Tankers move slowly through the darkness, their silhouettes barely visible against the horizon. Engines steady, routes unchanged. The system still working. From a distance, nothing seems different. Oil continues to flow. Ships continue to pass. The world continues to run. But beneath that surface, nothing has changed. The vulnerability is still there. The narrow lanes, the tension between nations, the possibility that everything moving through this passage could stop at any moment, because the global economy doesn't rest on something vast and unbreakable. It rests on systems like this, precise, efficient, and fragile, a single choke point, holding together supply chains, industries, entire economies, linked by movement that cannot afford to pause. And as long as that remains true, the question never fully disappears. Not really. It lingers, quietly. What happens when it finally does?